Capcom knows you've played Mickey Mouscapade, and they have a very special message for you on episode 152 of NES Works. We're sorry. The Disney-Capcom partnership started a little rough with Mickey Mouscapade, but here's the sophomore effort to make good. Hey, I guess this qualifies as one of those weird sequels that the NES was so famous for. This isn't merely a game that holds up to critical scrutiny decades later, it's also a synthesis of a lot of different creative and corporate threads for both companies involved. DuckTales is kind of a big deal. You might not have expected that outcome if you had played Mickey Mouscapade, a game that someone could only truly love if they first experienced it at age 7 and didn't know any better. It wasn't a bad game, but when you saw names like Capcom and Walt Disney on an NES package, you expected something more than a frustrating and decidedly generic 8-bit platformer. So yeah, the Disney-Capcom joint venture on NES didn't start off with its best foot forward. When the two companies shook hands on an agreement to develop software based on Disney properties, Capcom decided to take a shortcut to parlaying that into instant sales by licensing an older Mickey Mouse game from Hudson, while their own development team did research on the Disney universe, which is to say they spent a few days at Disneyland. And when I say development team, I mean the Capcom NES A-Team. Disney's DuckTales was produced by a small crew of internal talent who had previously worked on the likes of Ghosts and Goblins, Bionic Commando, Mega Man, and Destiny of an Emperor. And you can tell, while Capcom was boosting Sega's street cred by lending them the rights to develop and publish their own games for Genesis, the developer was also creating the baseline for that street cred here on NES. DuckTales plays like a mashup of all of Capcom's best releases for NES to this point. It has the rock-solid visuals and controls of the Mega Man games, the structure and interconnected stage design of Bionic Commando, and the on-the-fly quest distribution of an RPG like Destiny of an Emperor. At the same time, it feels like a game that is meaningfully based on the license. This is not some random action game that has a few cartoon character sprites and some familiar music shoehorned in. DuckTales for NES wouldn't have worked as a game based on any other property. You play as the elderly, money-grubbing Scrooge McDuck on a mission to collect as much cash as humanly, avianly possible. DuckTales is a score-based game, but not just in the arcade sense. Rather, you aim to gather as much money as possible, which means not only playing smartly, so you don't have to make use of the hidden health refill feature that costs Scrooge 3 million duck bucks a pop, but also poking around for cash in every corner of the game. Come to think of it, that might be the one thing DuckTales has in common with its predecessor, Mickey Mouscapade. Like that game, this is an adventure molded kind of in the shape of Milon's Secret Castle, which is to say an action game molded in the shape of the Tower of Draga. Secrets are hidden everywhere, and smacking random bits of scenery will more often than not reveal some sort of desirable bonus. What sets DuckTales apart from those other games is that the difference between success and failure doesn't really hinge on finding those secrets. You can play DuckTales in a fairly straightforward fashion, which admittedly still involves jumping between map areas as you hunt for your various quest objectives, and complete the game with little trouble. The secret hunting is tied to earning the best possible ending for Scrooge. The more cash he earns along the way, the better his finale. Basically, it's the same ending matrix that Nintendo would use for Wario Land and Luigi's Mansion, years before either of those games existed. Thankfully, Scrooge's lucky number 1 dime is in full effect here because he can find money everywhere. Gobs of it, giant bags of cash, and massive gemstones, just by hitting the scenery. I mean, yes, someone has scattered treasure chests around a haunted mansion in Transylvania, which tracks. But in Amazon caves and Himalayan snowdrifts? On the moon? That's Scrooge's incredible ability to manifest money at work, baby. And he can also just smack rocks and walls and coffins to make giant piles of wealth spring forth, a power seemingly unique to him, which is an accurate representation of the mechanisms of capitalism. It should be noted, though, that Scrooge cannot smack enemies with his cane. In order to tee up his golf swing, as is his genetic gift as a Scot, you need to press Scrooge against the surface he wants to whack. His neutral stance lacks an attack skill. This demonstrates something else that's remarkable about this game. It is, to my knowledge, the first genuine collaboration between Capcom's two divisions, Japan and USA. Although Capcom Japan talent designed and programmed DuckTales, a lot of the fine-tuning work was provided by Capcom USA, who made certain the game adhered to Disney brand guidelines. That's why Scrooge lacks an innate attack skill and doesn't run around Mega Man style with a gun. Disney created him as a character who relies on cunning, avarice, and determination to win the day, not as an action hero who wins with firepower. His great nephews and great nieces are canonically more likely to do the actiony stuff, and even they don't pop caps on the bad guys. I could see his ill-tempered nephew Donald firing weapons carelessly, but that's not Scrooge's way at all. There have been a few great interviews with Capcom USA staff members like Darlene Lacey over the years that go into detail about the American team's role in massaging DuckTales for NES, and that may be why this game shipped in the US first, arriving here as DuckTales several months before making its way onto Famicom as Wanpaku Duck Monogatari. And that way DuckTales presents a sort of mirror image of Sunsoft's Fester's Quest, which shipped around the same time. That game had been designed and planned by the US staff around an American media property, and then programmed and produced by the company's Japanese talent, starting in the US and ending in Japan, while DuckTales was clearly a top-to-bottom production by the Japan team that was finished up and tuned with American feedback. Both games demonstrate the increasing interrelation between American and Japanese creatives during the NES era, something new and different for the games industry. The distance between continents had begun to shrink, at least metaphorically, and the result was that video games began at times to feel less like work targeted toward one market or another, instead appealing to the common interests of American, Japanese, and I guess eventually European players. Not that it was hard to appeal to common interests with a game this good. Like I said earlier, DuckTales feels like the place where all of Capcom's best creative impulses finally came together in a game designed to be challenging, but not unmanageable for kids, and in a more organic fashion than Mega Man 2's hastily coded normal difficulty option that let Americans hit bad guys twice as hard while collecting way better power-ups. The difficulty levels here are more subtle. I mean, easy mode gives Scrooge a heaping bonus to his max health, which is pretty straightforward. But otherwise, increasing the difficulty primarily means that healing items spawn less frequently, and enemies are a little more dangerous. But Capcom's programmers felt that DuckTales was still easy enough that they didn't bother to include a password system or infinite continues. Between the multiple endings and the need to crisscross the world in order to complete Scrooge's quest, DuckTales manages to offer enough depth and replay incentive to sustain more than a weekend's rental worth of interest. More than anything else, DuckTales to me plays like a second attempt at NES Strider. Or more to the point, an attempt to apply the design concepts of NES Strider to a game that better represented Capcom's skills with the NES. Where Strider was buggy, confusing, and frustrating to control, DuckTales feels rock solid, relays quests through straightforward clues, and plays beautifully. If you told me that both cartridges resulted from a company initiative to take an external media property and turn it into an action RPG, I'd believe it. It's just that DuckTales turned out a whole lot better. It keeps things simple by giving Scrooge a fixed skill set from the moment the game begins and never really adds to them. He can waddle, jump, and smack stationary objects in order to extract their innate wealth. His only advanced move is a pogo jump, seemingly lifted from Link's down thrust in Zelda 2, which allows Scrooge to hop around on his cane and gain extra height, safely clear dangerous stretches of ground, and knock enemies out of commission. Not kill, mind you, Scrooge would never. And to balance its versatility, the pogo hop requires a little more effort to activate than Scrooge's other skills. You have to hold down and B while jumping in order to pogo, which isn't hard, but it does make the cane hop a deliberate act. And so Scrooge travels the world by warping into one of 5 different areas from the outset. The Amazon, the Himalayas, Transylvania, a mine in Africa, and the moon, all in search of a single legendary treasure per region. After defeating the boss of each area and collecting their treasure, Scrooge then has to return to Transylvania to battle Dracula Duck, not Count Duckula, thank you, before overcoming his ultimate nemesis, Flintheart Glomgold. It's not an especially challenging game. Most enemies appear to occupy spaces rather than guard or defend them, and there's not a huge amount of enemy aggression directed at Scrooge. As long as you play steadily and don't rush, it's entirely possible to beat this game on your first effort. A few little wrinkles do appear in the form of mini-quests that pop up in some of the stages, but you'll most likely complete these in the course of just poking around everywhere, searching for treasure. Likewise, there are hidden passages in Transylvania that you do need to uncover in order to complete the game, which might seem unreasonable if not for the fact that you'll inevitably stumble into them organically by pressing against those walls to tee up Scrooge's money-generating golf swing. While you only play as Scrooge, his whole entourage appears at various times to dole out quests and health refills, assist with his progression, or, in the case of Launchpad McQuack, offer him a one-time ride back to Duckburg. It's a short, sweet, simple game, and its brevity and relatively low difficulty are more than made up for by the fact that the game absolutely radiates quality in every respect. I would say that the game's enduring appeal neatly answers the question of whether people would prefer a slight, masterfully crafted game to a huge, sloppy one. Clearly, it's the former. DuckTales embodies everything that made Capcom great on NES. The visuals, the action, the controls, the music, the attention to detail, and it bodes a lot better with future crossover projects with Disney than Mickey Mouscapade did. This collaboration couldn't have been better timed. It coincided with Disney's renaissance in the late 80s. About a month after DuckTales shipped, The Little Mermaid appeared in theaters, and Disney was deemed to be officially back, baby. And the sudden return of Disney to being a respected institution, rather than a musty, outdated thing well past its prime, did a lot to help cement these Capcom titles in the hearts of kids everywhere. See, it wasn't just the American console biz that had cratered in sales that decade. Disney had wilted into a pale shadow of itself, with its increased focus on live-action movies that relegated its world-famous animation studios to second-tier status throughout the 1970s and 80s. Disney produced fewer animated films, and the ones that they did produce tended to underwhelm and underperform. Sure, 80s Disney efforts like The Black Cauldron and The Great Mouse Detective certainly have their fans, but those films lack the timeless quality of a Sleeping Beauty or Pinocchio. At the same time, veteran company talent like Don Bluth had abandoned ship to start their own ventures and get back into the business of creating lush animated movies. Meanwhile, the Japanese economic miracle resulted in some truly incredible-looking and decidedly modern cartoons that had begun trickling their way west, which caused a generation to stop and reconsider what a cartoon could even be. So, by the mid-80s, Disney no longer stood at the cutting edge of cartoons thanks to Japan, and it wasn't even producing the best traditional animation thanks to Bluth Productions. Things were kind of bleak for the company for a while. Luckily for Disney, a change in corporate leadership heralded an effort to restore the shine to the lackluster Disney name. Michael Eisner is certainly not the most beloved name in entertainment history, but he unquestionably whipped the Disney company back into shape with bleeding-edge animated productions like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and lush contemporary hand-drawn films like The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast. Perhaps even more importantly, Disney also made an effort under Eisner to create accessible animation for kids of all ages, which is to say, television shows. For decades, the only way to really watch Disney animation was waiting for movies to recirculate in theaters, which tended to happen about once a decade or so for a given film. Buying VHS tapes, which cost in the neighborhood of $100, and I'm talking about strong 80s bucks at that. Or hoping that the ABC Sunday night World of Disney for the week would be a cartoon and not some creaky old live-action production from the 1950s. But beginning in 1984 and 85, Disney began creating new cartoons for TV, and they were pretty strong, if not precisely masterpieces. Adventures of the Gummy Bears may not have offered the most compelling characters and stories, but its animation technically outclassed everything else airing in the Saturday morning cartoon block, punching competitively with import productions, like Tokyo Movie Sensha's The Littles. Anyway, Disney's experiments with Gummy Bears and the Wuzzles proved successful enough that they decided to apply that approach to recognizable characters. No heavy hitters on the level of Mickey Mouse, mind you, but the company trotted out some of its B and C tier characters to create a show called DuckTales. DuckTales debuted as a short-run series at the beginning of 1987, and a syndicated production run followed soon after, which lasted through 1990. Everything about DuckTales speaks to a company that had stepped back, scoped out the current landscape of animated entertainment, and forged ahead with a killer strategy. For starters, when I say that Disney created DuckTales, I mean contracted Japanese animation powerhouse TMS to produce DuckTales. Following in the steps of high-end TV cartoons like The Littles, G.I. Joe, Inspector Gadget, and The Real Ghostbusters, Disney farmed out the animation to a Japanese studio. The same studio that was about to blow the world's collective mind with the 1988 theatrical release of Akira. Yes, this means that DuckTales is anime. Sorry, haters. And the results speak for themselves. DuckTales looks great for a television cartoon, and the scripts and acting, which were handled in the US, were top-notch as well. Like the NES game, the cartoon itself was an international production. And to my mind, the fact that the NES game exists at all suggests that Disney had cribbed notes from its old colleague, Don Bluth, whose fledgling studio had made a name for itself a few years earlier by producing gorgeous original animation for the game Dragon's Lair. By 1989, Laserdisc games were, well, not dead, but taking a break until the 16-bit CD-ROM add-ons arrived and rebranded the format of interactive FMV movies. Disney skipped the whole pretending you can play a cartoon thing and just went for a partnership with one of the most acclaimed developers on the hottest console in the market, correctly gambling that having Capcom make great video games that use the innate vocabulary of video games, rather than posturing as interactive movies, would win young hearts and minds. Like the NES itself, DuckTales stands out as a rare example of perfect synergy, where a lot of factors came together in a more satisfactory way than anyone involved really could have predicted. DuckTales became a massive seller, maybe not quite as big as the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle games, but certainly one of Capcom's strongest releases for NES. And for my money, DuckTales is a better and more cohesive game than anything that involved the Turtles on NES. It just feels quintessentially NES-like, a celebration of everything that kids loved about the system, and a pretty strong piece of counter-programming against the new 16-bit consoles. Sure, it didn't look as good as Ghouls and Ghosts on Genesis, but it was a complete package in a way that nothing for a next-gen console in 1989 managed to be, besides maybe legendary acts. With fast, fluid action, meaningful connections to its source material, and design that made it compelling to revisit over and over in pursuit of better endings, it's just good fun. The platonic ideal of what a video game can be. That made it especially refreshing in an era in which games based on licensed properties tended to fall one of two ways. They could be grandiose yet messy attempts to embrace the license, as with things like Rambo, The Goonies 2, or Jaws, or they could be generic and usually mediocre action games with a license hastily grafted on, as with Airwolf, Predator, or Keith Courage. To come across a legitimately great game that was clearly built from the ground up to feature the licensed property and embrace its themes, well, that's the kind of thing that just sets kids' expectations to unrealistic levels for the future. But it's good to teach children to hope for the best and to introduce them to the reality of how life so rarely delivers. If nothing else, DuckTales was an important life experience. It seems somehow fitting to me that DuckTales would be the game to shatter the ceiling of mediocrity for the lowly, licensed 8-bit game. After all, DuckTales itself was a property born from exceeding expectations. Like I said before, the DuckTales cartoon centered around B and C tier characters. It wasn't about Disney's famous duck, Donald, but rather his nephews and uncle. That would seem like a weird choice for a cartoon when an iconic duck protagonist was right there. But if you know the history behind the show, it makes sense. Scrooge got his start as a secondary character in Disney's Donald Duck comics in the 1940s, an avaricious antagonist for Donald, who lived only to make his nephew's life miserable. But over time, the uncredited good duck artist who wrote and drew the Donald Duck series devoted more page space to Scrooge, developing him as a character, and ultimately turning him into a deuteragonist alongside Donald, then eventually spinning out into his own dedicated line of comic books that ran for more than 3 decades. The DuckTales cartoon picked up just a few years after Disney had discontinued the Uncle Scrooge comics line, and its best storylines were usually taken directly from the pages of those comics. The NES game is a few Xerox generations removed from its heritage, but the work that Carl Barks, that good duck artist I mentioned, and Don Rosa did to build Scrooge, his home in Duckburg, and all of his friends and foes carries through all the same. There's a real legacy behind DuckTales that Disney only really began truly acknowledging and celebrating within the past 15 or 20 years. But DuckTales for NES feels like a worthy successor to their work. Just as Barks and Rosa's stories were the epitome of great all-ages adventure comics, Capcom's first true Disney collaboration offers a reminder of what makes games so great. What a blessing of an NES cart. Next time on NES Works, things get a little spicy in ancient China when Koei explores the world's greatest menage a trois.